I once paid $43 for an oyster in Tokyo because a Japanese fisherman with 3 teeth told me it would make me a better man. He didn't speak English, and I don't speak Japanese. He just pointed at the oyster, then at me, flexed his bicep, which was somehow larger than mine despite him being roughly 70 years old and built like a fishing pole. I ate the oyster and didn't feel different, but here's what I discovered later. Male testosterone levels have fallen by about 1% per year since the 1980s. A man in his 30s today has the hormonal profile of a man in his 50s from 1985. And that $43 oyster is connected to exactly why this is happening. Because the more that I read about that oyster, the more I noticed a pattern. Every culture that ever produced impressively strong men was obsessed with a very specific group of foods. And almost none of those foods are still on the modern menu. That testosterone decline isn't just a vibe. That's the Traveson study straight out of the New England Research Institutes, published in 2007 and replicated multiple times since then. Sperm counts have dropped by roughly 59% over the same window, according to Shauna Swan at Mount Sinai, whose 2017 meta-analysis pulled from 185 separate studies across 53 countries. Grip strength in young men has fallen so far that the average American 20-year-old today has weaker hands than the average 60-year-old did in 1985. So I went looking for what changed, and the trail leads through every empire that ever mattered. So start with the Sumerians, because everyone starts with them. 5,000 years ago, their physicians were prescribing bull testicles, raw liver, and fermented fish paste to men with what they politely called the weakness. They had zero concept of hormones or Leydig cells. They just noticed that men who ate those things stayed strong longer. Now the Egyptians did basically the same exact thing, except they were weirdly obsessed with a specific kind of bitter lettuce called Lactuca virosa. I hope I didn't butcher that, which they considered sacred to the fertility god Min, and they ate fenugreek by the bowl. Modern endocrinology has actually confirmed it raises free testosterone by reducing SHBG, or sex hormone binding globulin. A 2011 study in phytotherapy research found a 25% jump in free T over 8 weeks. The pharaohs were not guessing. Then you get to the Spartans, who built the most feared military in the ancient world on a diet that would give a modern dietitian a stroke. Their main meal was something called black broth, which was pork blood, vinegar, and pig legs, simmered until it became a substance no one ever voluntarily eaten since. Plus olive oil, figs, salted fish, and organ meat, loaded with cholesterol, which is the literal molecule your body converts into testosterone, loaded with zinc and selenium. The Spartans started this diet at age 7. They produced 30-year-old men who looked like modern 20-year-olds. So the Romans took that template and got pretty fancy with it. Lambs, eggs, goat cheese, honey, and oysters by the absolute dozen. Pliny the Elder wrote that oysters were the food of the powerful. He didn't know why, but now we know. One medium-sized oyster has more zinc than nearly anything else on this earth. And zinc is the mineral your Leydig cells literally cannot produce testosterone without. The legionaries on campaign carried something called buccellatum, which was twice baked hardtack along slabs of cured pork, hard cheese, and a sour wine called posca that was basically vinegar water. Not glamorous at all. But it kept the 30-pound packs of armor moving 20 miles a day for 30 years per enlistment. Same pattern, different continent. Now the Vikings ate cold water, fatty fish, reindeer, elk, butter, and fermented dairy. The most ridiculous example is something called hekar, which is shark meat buried in the ground for 3 months until it ferments into a substance that smells like ammonia and is reportedly so pungent that first-time eaters have to plug their nose. But the Vikings ate it casually. The Mongols, who built the largest empire in human history, lived almost entirely on meat, which was organ meat and fermented mare's milk called arag. And when food ran out, they drank blood directly from the neck of their own horse. A Mongol warrior on campaign consumed almost zero vegetables and almost zero grain for months at a stretch. By every modern guideline, this should have killed him. Instead, he conquered from Korea to Hungary. Now, if that isn't a slap in the face, I don't know what is. The samurai trained on rice, miso, sea cucumber, raw fish, and various marine eggs, including the eggs of sea urchin, which Japanese fishermen still call the food that makes men. There's a specific neighborhood in Tokyo, Tsukiji, where 70-year-old men line up at 6 in the morning to eat raw sea urchin for breakfast. Trust me, it's not a wellness trend. It's a continuous 500-year-old tradition that nobody bothered to interrupt. The Maasai of East Africa drank raw cow's blood mixed with milk. The Inuit ate seal blubber and whale skin and somehow had functionally zero heart disease until processed food arrived in the 1970s. The native Hawaiians ate poi, taro, raw fish, and the liver of basically every animal they caught. And they had a specific word, awa, for the post-meal feeling of vitality. So to put this into context, this is every continent, every climate, and zero communication between them all. The same short list of foods keep appearing. Red meat, origami, whole fat dairy, honey, shellfish, animal fat. For about 5,000 years, the formula held. Then, in roughly one human lifetime, almost all of it disappeared. Okay, let me actually talk to you for a second. If you're watching this, you've probably been told your entire life that the foods I just listed are bad for you. Eggs raise your cholesterol. Red meat causes cancer. Butter clogs your arteries. Saturated fat will kill you. And almost every single man on the planet, including me, and including probably you too, if you're a man, grew up inside that story. We didn't choose it. We inherited it. So when I say the foods that built every warrior culture in human history are the same foods modern dietary guidelines told us to avoid, I'm not blaming you for not eating them. I'm telling you the math was rigged before you were old enough to read the menu. The rigging started in 1899. When a chemist named David Wesson figured out how to extract oil from cotton seeds, which were previously thrown away or fed to cattle. Now, Procter & Gamble bought the patent, called the product Crisco, and within 40 years, industrial seed oils, soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed had replaced the animal fats human beings had cooked with since fire. These oils are extraordinarily high in linoleic acid. Recent work out of Stefan Goyenet's group and others has linked high linoleic acid intake to suppressed testosterone production at the cellular level, particularly by upregulating aromatase, the enzyme that converts testosterone into estrogen. American consumption of linoleic acid has increased by roughly 1,000% since 1900. No, that's not made up. Then we got sugar. The average American man now consumes about 150 pounds of added sugar per year. A medieval peasant ate maybe 4 pounds. Sugar consumption alone has shown to crash testosterone levels by up to 25% within 2 hours of intake, likely by triggering insulin resistance that disrupts the entire hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. That's a 2013 study out of Massachusetts General Hospital. Then we got refined flour. After World War II, soy quietly invaded everything. Infant formula, bread, processed meat, and protein bars. Soy contains phytoestrogens which mimic estradiol in the male body. The average modern man now consumes soy in some form of roughly 70% of packaged products. And then, in 1977, the United States government issued the McGovern Report, formally telling American men to eat less red meat, fewer eggs, less butter, and less saturated fat. The advice was largely based on the work of one researcher, Ansel Keys, whose 7-country study famously left out about 15 other countries whose data didn't fit the hypothesis. It became a national policy anyway. Within 10 years, the egg industry collapsed by 30%, and butter consumption was replaced by margarine, which we know now was packed with trans fats so harmful that we eventually banned by the FDA in 2018. And right on cue, starting in the 1980s, the testosterone curve began to drop. But there's one more layer to this, and it might be the worst one. Microplastics, atrazine in drinking water, BPA in food packaging. These are endocrine disrupting chemicals, and the research on them is genuinely alarming. Shauna Swan, the same researcher behind the sperm count study, has documented measurable phthalate exposure in over 95% of Americans tested. Research from Fred von Saal and others has shown those chemicals don't just sit there. They mimic estrogen, they suppress testosterone production, and they accumulate in fat tissue. The modern man is not just missing the food that built the ancestors. The modern man is not just missing the foods that built his ancestors, he's actively absorbing chemicals that work against the food that he does eat. Now here's the strange, slightly hopeful part. None of those old foods went extinct. The oysters are still in the ocean. The grass-fed beef is still in the pasture. Pastured eggs, wild salmon, raw honey, liver, fermented dairy, olive oil, Brazil nuts heavy with selenium, and pomegranate are still all readily available. The Persian kings used to drink pomegranate juice for vitality. In a 2012 study in Endocrinology Reviews found pomegranate juice raised salivary testosterone by 24% in just 2 weeks. After I saw that, I started drinking pomegranate juice every single day, and I still do to this day. See, every single food that built every man who ever conquered anything is still available. None of it was destroyed. It was just quietly moved off the main shelf and replaced with something cheaper. Which brings me back to my $43 oyster. I still don't know if it did anything. The Japanese fisherman definitely did not check in on my hormone levels, but I think about him sometimes. The 70-year-old man with a bicep, and I think about the fact that he grew up on an island where men have been eating oysters and sea cucumber and fatty fish for 2,000 years without interruption. He didn't get a memo telling him that those foods were dangerous. He just ate what his grandfather ate, who ate what his grandfather ate. The men of every prior era are not stronger than us because they are genetically different. They basically just ate differently. The food never left. We did.